Right now, gram for gram, a spice sitting in your kitchen cabinet is worth more than gold. Not a rare vintage wine, not a diamond-dusted delicacy, just a handful of dried red threads pulled from the center of a purple flower. At roughly $7,000 to $10,000 per kilogram at the high end, saffron regularly outprices gold on the open market, and it has held that strange distinction for most of recorded history. Picture a field in the half-dark before sunrise, rows of pale violet crocus flowers just opening their petals to the first grey light. Workers move down the rows bent at the waist, fingers moving fast and precise, plucking out 3 tiny crimson stigmas from each blossom before the sun climbs high enough to wilt them. It takes somewhere around 150,000 flowers, harvested entirely by hand, to produce a single kilogram of the finished spice. There is no machine that can do this job. There never has been. Every thread of saffron that has ever touched a plate, a dye vat, a temple altar, or a battlefield medicine kit was placed there by a human hand, working in the cold dark of early morning. So here is the question worth sitting with. Why would human beings, across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, agree to pay such a staggering price for the stigma of a flower that offers no calories, no shelter, no obvious survival value at all? What is it about this specific plant that convinced pharaohs, emperors, popes, and modern hedge funds alike that it was worth more than the metal we use to measure wealth itself? The answer, it turns out, involves sacred temples and painted palace walls, a Greek myth about a doomed young man, merchants who turned ritual into fortune, a war triggered by a single stolen shipment, industrial-scale fraud that reshaped food law, wartime propaganda campaigns, and a modern trade still shadowed by smuggling and price manipulation. This is not just the story of a spice. It is the story of how humanity decided, over and over again, across every era it has lived through, that a little crimson thread was worth almost anything. Long before saffron had a price, it had a purpose, and that purpose was almost always sacred. On the walls of an ancient palace on the island of Crete, painted plaster survives showing figures gathering flowers with delicate, deliberate care, a scene historians have long connected to the harvesting of the crocus and its prized threads. This was not agriculture as we think of it today. It was closer to devotion. The people rendering these images were not simply recording a chore, they were memorializing an act that carried weight beyond the physical plant itself. Saffron, even in these earliest depictions, appears in the company of goddesses, ceremony, and color, never as mere foodstuff. Move east, and the pattern only intensifies. In Persian court culture, saffron threads were woven directly into textiles reserved for royalty, its golden red hue functioning as a visible signal of rank that ordinary citizens were forbidden to wear. To dress in saffron was to declare, wordlessly, that you stood close to the throne. In Egypt, saffron appears in the toolkit of physicians and embalmers alike, prescribed for ailments of the stomach and the eyes, and used in preparations believed to soothe the body in this life and preserve it for the next. It was medicine and mysticism operating as a single, undivided practice, because in the ancient world there was often no meaningful line between the two. The Greeks, for their part, folded saffron into both temple ritual and daily luxury, scattering the threads across bedding, using it to scent and color bathwater, and burning it as offering in religious rites meant to please the gods with fragrance alone. Physicians in the Greek tradition also prescribed saffron as a remedy, listing it among treatments for everything from digestive trouble to respiratory ailments, embedding it in the medical vocabulary of the era. What unites Crete, Persia, Egypt, and Greece is not geography or language, but function. In every one of these civilizations, saffron was never treated as an ordinary crop grown for calories or comfort. It was treated as something closer to a divine substance, one that happened to grow from a flower. Kings dyed their robes in it to prove their closeness to heaven. Priests burned it to prove their devotion. Physicians prescribed it to prove their command over the mysteries of the body. Long before a single merchant thought to weigh it against silver or gold, saffron had already been assigned a value that had nothing to do with economics and everything to do with power, purity, and the divine. That sacred reputation did not fade as centuries passed. If anything, it hardened into cultural memory, becoming the foundation stone upon which every later saffron industry, obsession, and scandal would eventually be built. Before it was ever a commodity, saffron was a covenant between mortals and the gods they hoped were watching. And it is precisely this reputation, this aura of sacredness stretching back across so many ancient cultures at once, that gave the Greeks something they could not resist explaining through story. Which brings us to a young man named Crocus, and the myth the ancient world told itself to explain why a flower could possibly be worth so much. The story goes like this. Crocus was a mortal youth of striking beauty, depending on which ancient source you consult, either a companion or a rival in love to the god Hermes. The two were said to have been playing a game of discus that most Greek of pastimes when tragedy struck. Hermes's throw went astray, or Crocus stepped into its path, and the disc struck the young man in the head, killing him where he fell. Grief-stricken, the gods refused to let the moment end in ordinary death. From the drops of his blood soaking into the earth, they caused a flower to spring up, its petals pale and delicate, but at its center 3 blood-red threads, forever marking the spot where a beautiful young man had died too soon. Some versions swap the discus for jealousy, adding a nymph named Smilax into the story, as a spurned lover transformed alongside him, because Greek mythology rarely resisted the urge to complicate a tragedy with romance. Either way, the message embedded in the tale was clear. Saffron's crimson threads were blood made permanent, a flower stained by loss, sorrow, and divine regret. It is a beautiful story. It is also almost certainly not true, and more importantly, it was never meant to be. Here is where we pause the poetry and bring in the botanists. Because the actual origin of Crocus sativus has nothing to do with wounded gods and everything to do with agricultural accident and deliberate human selection. The saffron crocus, unlike its wild cousins, is what scientists call a sterile triploid, meaning it cannot reproduce on its own through seeds. Every single saffron crocus in cultivation today exists only because humans have propagated it by hand, dividing and replanting its corms generation after generation for thousands of years. In other words, saffron is not a flower that occurred in nature and was later discovered. It is closer to a technology, an ancient genetic intervention performed by farmers who almost certainly did not understand chromosomes but understood results. Most botanical historians now trace its likely origin to a wild relative, Crocus cartwrightianus, growing on Crete or in the wider Aegean, selectively bred over generations for longer, more vivid stigmas until it stabilized into the sterile, high-yield version we still harvest today. That is a far less romantic story than a god's grief spilling across a meadow. But it is also, in its own way, more astonishing, because it means saffron's very existence as a spice is itself an act of human ambition dressed up afterward in mythology. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it establishes a pattern you are going to see again and again throughout saffron's history. Ancient peoples encountered something valuable, mysterious, and difficult to explain through ordinary means, so they wrapped it in a story that made the value feel inevitable, sacred, cosmic. The myth of Crocus was never really about a boy and a discus. It was a civilization's way of justifying why it was willing to pay so extraordinarily much for 3 tiny threads plucked from the center of a flower. Strip away the poetry, and what remains is something more interesting than blood and gods. What remains is trade, agriculture, and the very human instinct to mythologize whatever we cannot afford to lose. Somewhere around the 6th century BC, in the crowded ports of Tyre or Sidon, or perhaps further east along the caravan cities of the Persian plateau, saffron stopped being a secret kept by priests and pharaohs and became something else entirely, a product. Picture a Phoenician trader, a man in his 40s, weathered from decades at sea, standing on a dock with a small wooden chest sealed in wax. He is not a priest. He is not a king. He is a merchant, an outsider to the temples that once controlled saffron's sacred use. And he has figured out something the empires had not fully reckoned with yet, that a substance this light, this potent, and this universally desired could be turned into the ancient world's most efficient store of value. Saffron threads weigh almost nothing. A single camel could carry, folded into cloth and packed into jars, a fortune large enough to buy land, soldiers, or silence. This made it perfect cargo for a world without banks, without paper currency, without any reliable way to move wealth across 1,000 miles of desert and sea. You did not need to trust a foreign king's coinage. If you were carrying something every foreign king already wanted for his own physicians, his own dyers, his own temple offerings. Saffron became, in effect, a universal currency long before any coin achieved that status. It moved along the same routes that would later carry silk, routes threading through Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia into the Mediterranean world, and at every stop its price climbed, because at every stop somebody with power decided they could not be without it. Persian nobility scattered saffron threads into their bathwater and mixed it into royal perfumes. Egyptian elites imported it for embalming rituals and cosmetic dyes, even after their own domestic supply had been exhausted. Greek and later Roman aristocrats sprinkled saffron-infused water through amphitheaters and banquet halls, not for taste, but for status, because everyone watching would know exactly what that fragrance cost. Weight for weight, saffron often traded above the value of gold itself, and this is the detail worth sitting with, because it was not scarcity of the flower alone that drove the price. It was labor. Then, as now, each flower produced only 3 fragile stigmas, and each stigma had to be harvested by hand within the same narrow window of dawn before the bloom wilted. An entrepreneur moving saffron across 3 empires was not simply selling a spice. He was selling thousands of hours of invisible human labor, compressed into a thimble-sized volume, wrapped in mystique, and sold to people who had never seen a single flower plucked. This is how saffron made the leap from altar to marketplace, and it is a transformation that would repeat itself in different costumes across every century that followed. By the time saffron reached medieval Europe, it had already lived a dozen lives as sacrament, medicine, and merchant's treasure. Now it was about to become something else entirely, a matter of civic law, fortified walls, and open warfare. Cultivation took root in unlikely soil. The Swiss city of Basel, a fortified trading hub on the Rhine, became one of Europe's great saffron markets. Its guild halls and warehouses, built in part on the back of the crimson thread. An entire English town reorganized its identity around the crop, renaming itself Saffron Walden after the fields of purple blooms that ringed its markets each autumn. This was not a rare curiosity anymore. It was infrastructure. Entire local economies, tax structures, and property values in these towns rose and fell with the health of the saffron harvest, and where that much wealth concentrates in one fragile commodity, trouble tends to follow. It followed in 1374, in what historians now refer to, with a certain flat understatement, as the Saffron War. The spark was almost absurdly small for the bloodshed it produced. A shipment of saffron, worth a fortune in transit, was hijacked before it reached its buyers. But a stolen shipment of saffron was never really about the spice itself. It was about the enormous sums of money the theft represented and the retaliation it demanded. Armed conflict broke out. Cities mobilized resources to defend trade routes and warehouses, and for a brief, strange window in European history, men took up arms over a flour whose product could be crushed between two fingers. Rulers took notice, and rulers, as they tend to do, moved quickly to control what they could not ignore. Local authorities across Germany and Switzerland began drafting strict laws governing the purity, weight, and sale of saffron, aware that counterfeit and adulterated batches could devastate a city's reputation as a trading center overnight. The penalties were not gentle. In parts of the German lands, saffron fraud, mixing the true stigmas with dyed threads, marigold petals, or worthless plant matter, was treated not as a minor swindle, but as a capital offense. Merchants caught adulterating saffron could be fined ruinously, banished, or in the most severe documented cases, executed, sometimes by burning the counterfeit goods alongside the counterfeiter. This was the Saffron Show Code, among the earliest known food purity regulations in European history, centuries before anyone used the phrase consumer protection. Think about that for a second. A spice so valuable that faking it could get you killed. It tells you everything about how thoroughly saffron had fused, by the 14th century, with concepts of law, trust, and civic honor. The ritual object had become a jealously guarded, legally weaponized asset, protected the way empires protect currency, because in every practical sense, that is exactly what it had become. But regulation, as history shows again and again, only slows corruption. It rarely stops it, and Saffron's next chapter would prove that in humiliating detail. Fast forward past the Saffron Show Code, past the executions and the burnings, and the incentive to cheat never actually disappeared. It simply changed shape. As Europe industrialized and demand for saffron spread beyond royal kitchens and cathedral dye vats into a growing middle-class market for medicines, perfumes, and colored fabrics. The sheer volume of saffron people wanted began to outpace what harvesters could physically pluck from the fields at dawn. And wherever demand outruns supply, someone, somewhere, starts looking for a shortcut. Adulteration became less a scandal and more an industry unto itself. Dried marigold petals, safflower, turmeric-dyed threads, even shredded fibers dusted with chalk or glycerin to mimic saffron's weight and sheen, all of it got bundled, bagged, and sold at saffron prices to buyers who had no way of telling the difference by sight alone. Because that is the uncomfortable truth about saffron fraud. Once the threads are dried, crushed, or ground into powder, the real thing and the fake thing can look almost identical to the naked eye. You are trusting the seller. And sellers across the industrializing cities of Europe were routinely abusing that trust on an industrial scale. What finally exposed the scope of the problem was not a single dramatic whistleblower with a flair for the theatrical, but something quieter and arguably more damning: the rise of chemical analysis as a tool of public accountability. As laboratories developed the ability to test food and spice samples under a microscope and through basic chemical reagents, inspectors and analysts working for emerging public health and trade bodies began systematically testing saffron sold in open markets. And the results were embarrassing. Batch after batch came back adulterated, some barely containing any genuine Crocus sativus stigma at all. These findings did not stay quiet. They moved through trade journals, municipal health reports, and public commentary, building pressure that governments could no longer wave away as merchant gossip. The response was regulation, again, but this time codified through the emerging apparatus of the modern state rather than medieval guild law. Food purity statutes, chemical testing standards, and formal definitions of what could legally be labeled saffron began appearing across Europe, forcing sellers to prove authenticity or face fines and seizure of goods, not execution this time, but bureaucratic enforcement, the industrial era's answer to the stake and the noose. It is a quieter kind of justice, less theatrical, but arguably more effective, because it did not rely on fear of death. It relied on the much more modern fear of an inspector's stamp, a failed test, and a ruined business. The pattern is worth sitting with for a moment. Every single time saffron's value spiked, fraud followed within a generation, and every single time fraud spread far enough, some institution, civic, royal, or scientific, stepped in to draw a harder line around what counted as real. Saffron did not just inspire regulation once. It kept forcing it, century after century, because the incentive to fake liquid gold never went away. It only waited for the next opportunity. By the 20th century, saffron had stopped being merely a commodity and had become a symbol, and symbols, unlike spices, can be owned by nobody and exploited by everybody. Empires and nation-states discovered that a flower already carrying 3,000 years of sacred and commercial weight made for extraordinarily convenient propaganda. Consider the color itself. Saffron's deep orange-red dye had already marked the robes of Buddhist monks and Hindu ascetics for centuries, a visual shorthand for renunciation and spiritual authority. Colonial administrators and later nationalist movements in South Asia did not invent that meaning, but they were quick to inherit it, wrapping it in flags, sashes, and political iconography until the color itself became inseparable from questions of religious and national identity. A pigment once used to dye a wealthy Roman's toga or an Egyptian priest's linen was now doing the work of statecraft, and it did so without a single stigma of the actual spice needing to change hands. That is the peculiar power of saffron. Even its color could be weaponized long after the plant itself had become almost incidental to the message. Meanwhile, back in the realm of actual harvests, saffron-producing regions leaned hard into branding their crop as a badge of national craftsmanship and purity. A marketing instinct that treated the flower less as agriculture and more as heritage, something closer to a vintage wine or a protected cheese than a mere ingredient. Advertisers understood, correctly, that consumers were not simply buying flavor. They were buying the story of hand-harvested authenticity, of dawn fields and centuries-old technique. A narrative far easier to sell than the plain fact that saffron is, chemically speaking, just dried plant tissue. Picture the marketer here as an archetype rather than a single named figure, the 20th-century advertising executive who takes an ancient ritual object and repackages it for a modern consumer audience anxious about authenticity in an age of mass production. This figure did not need to lie. Saffron's actual history of purity laws, execution-era fraud crackdowns, and hand labor scarcity was already dramatic enough to sell. All the marketer had to do was polish it, frame it, and put it on a label. Wartime economies added another layer entirely, because any commodity this expensive, this compact, and this easy to smuggle inevitably becomes strategically interesting the moment borders close and supply chains strain. A substance worth more than gold by weight does not stop being valuable just because armies are on the move. If anything, scarcity during conflict only reinforces the mystique, turning saffron into a quiet marker of privilege for those who could still obtain it when ordinary people could not. Every propaganda poster celebrating a nation's traditional harvest, every food label invoking centuries-old purity, every brand slogan whispering authenticity, was doing the same thing the saffron show inspectors and industrial chemists had done a century earlier, just with softer tools. Where regulation used fines and seizure to define what saffron truly was, marketing used story and symbol to define what saffron truly meant. Both were responses to the same underlying tension. An object too valuable, too easily faked, and too culturally loaded to ever be left alone. Today, the center of gravity for saffron production has shifted decisively eastward, and the map of who grows the world's saffron tells its own story of geopolitics, climate, and control. Iran now produces the overwhelming majority of the global supply. Its harvests concentrated in the arid plains around Mashhad and the northeastern province of Khorasan, where the soil and climate happen to be almost perfectly suited to Crocus sativus. Kashmir, on the disputed border between India and Pakistan, produces a smaller but historically prestigious crop, grown on the Karewa highlands, where farmers still harvest by hand exactly as their ancestors did 1,000 years earlier. Spain, once the dominant European exporter and the source of the label most Western consumers still associate with quality saffron, now grows only a fraction of what it once did, with much of the saffron sold under Spanish branding actually imported, reprocessed, and repackaged rather than grown domestically. That gap between label and origin is not an accident. It is a business model, and it means a spice jar proudly displaying a European flag may contain threads that traveled thousands of miles from fields most consumers will never see, and workers most consumers will never think about. The labor itself has changed remarkably little across the centuries. Harvesters still rise before sunrise, because the crocus flower opens at dawn and begins to wilt within hours, degrading the delicate stigmas inside. Workers move through the fields, plucking each purple bloom by hand, then sit for hours separating the 3 crimson threads from every flower with tweezers or careful fingers, a process no machine has ever successfully replicated at scale. It takes roughly 150,000 individual flowers to produce a single kilogram of dried saffron. Think about that for a second. 150,000 flowers, each one grown, tended, and harvested by hand, just to fill a container the size of a bag of sugar. That arithmetic alone explains why the spice remains staggeringly expensive, no matter how much technology reshapes the rest of modern agriculture. And the labor is disproportionately performed by women, particularly in Kashmir and Iran, where saffron harvesting has become one of the few reliable sources of seasonal income, in otherwise economically strained rural regions. This is where the story gets uncomfortably contemporary. Saffron production in regions like Kashmir has been directly affected by military conflict, border closures, and political instability, with harvests disrupted by curfews, communication blackouts, and the general chaos of a disputed territory. Meanwhile, price manipulation, hoarding, and export restrictions periodically ripple through the global market. Because when a handful of regions control nearly all the world's supply of something this valuable, the incentive to game that scarcity never really goes away. Before we go further, if you are the kind of person who wants more stories like this one, hidden histories tucked inside ordinary objects sitting in your kitchen cabinet, go ahead and subscribe now, because there are plenty more coming. The saffron trade in the 21st century, in other words, is not some quaint artisanal footnote to history. It is a living continuation of everything that came before it, labor-intensive, fraud-prone, politically charged, and still, after 4,000 years, absurdly, stubbornly expensive. So picture her again, that harvester in the pale grey light before sunrise, moving down a row of violet flowers with fingers that have done this 1,000 times before. She is not thinking about gold futures or nationalist flags or medieval execution statutes. She is thinking about getting the stigmas out before the sun climbs high enough to wilt them. Because that is the job, and it always has been. But now you know what she is actually holding. You know that those 3 crimson threads in her palm carry the residue of a Bronze Age ritual. The blood of a mythical Greek boy, the ledgers of Phoenician traders who treated it like currency because, functionally, it was. You know it triggered armed conflict when a caravan of it went missing in medieval Europe, that entire cities built their economies and their legal codes around protecting it, that men were fined, banished, and in the worst cases put to death for cutting it with fraud. You know that industrial-era hucksters flooded markets with dyed grass and chalk dust, and that it took chemists and inspectors to drag the truth back out into the open. You know it was dyed into the robes of monks seeking to renounce the material world entirely, and then, with a kind of grim irony, was seized upon by nationalists and marketers to sell exactly that world back to people as heritage, purity, and prestige. Saffron, in other words, is not one story. It is every story humanity tells about value itself, compressed into a flower that cannot even reproduce on its own, that must be replanted by hand, generation after generation, because we decided a very long time ago that it was worth the trouble. That is why it still outprices gold by weight in markets from Mashhad to Barcelona. Not because it is rare in some geological sense, like a diamond buried under a continent for 1 billion years, but because it has never stopped demanding human hands, human patience, and human willingness to lie, kill, regulate, and market our way around its scarcity. Gold just sits there. Saffron has always required somebody, somewhere, to get up before dawn and choose to pick it anyway. So the next time you see that tiny glass vial on a spice rack, priced like a small crime, understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at 4,000 years of ritual, empire, war, fraud, and reinvention, folded into a thread so small it dissolves the instant it hits water. Saffron was never really about flavor. It was always about what people are willing to pay, fight, lie, and bleed for. And it turns out the answer to that question is quite a lot. For something you can hold a fortune of in one closed fist.